Okay, you're all very welcome to this presentation about dystraxia, and I will explain what the word means in a few moments, and I'll explain where it came from. I'm presenting it as a new theory about cognitive development, school failure, delinquency, and ADHD, and I hope that the reason for that addendum will come clear later on. I'm very aware that I may have hit on a variable that explains a lot of the strange behavior in young people, and that it may be through no fault of their own. And I would hope that you can consider that as a hypothesis. I worked for over 30 years as a guidance counselor and as a psychologist. And in that time, I've worked with thousands of young people, and I always claim that whatever the normal curve is, I saw that every day. So when I saw something that was outside the normal curve, it became very, very apparent to me. But from a scientific point of view, experience can produce a theory, but really the theory then should be producing hypothesis, which will turn to research. And I really do believe that dystraxia needs research. And for the moment, I'm just presenting the theory based on minimal research. And that's the overall context of it. How this came about, in 1985, I became interested in reality therapy and was fortunate enough to have William Glasser himself as my trainer for the first session. And as I proceeded to use it in a school of over 1,000 students, I found that some students just didn't seem to be able to take a sense of responsibility, which is very much at the heart of reality therapy. And I was wondering why, and I reached the conclusion that it had something to do with their cognitive ability. And in 2005, in an article, I wrote that without the ability to abstract, you could be disorganized, insensitive, and irresponsible at best. At worst, you might be impulsive, psychopathic, and delinquent. And all of this seems to rely on your cognitive development. The lack of this ability to abstract is not an inherent genetic defect. It is simply an ability that has not matured properly. I thought that I discovered a little niche in counselling, a group of people that were difficult to counsel because they didn't have the ability to abstract. And then one day in around 2005, I came across a group of young people who were in alternative education. And it hit me in the face. They may as well have had green eyes. It just stood out. I knew them from previous experience. And they all had this thing in common. Whatever it was, they all had it in common. And for a moment, I realized that this was not just a little corner of counselling. This was something much more widespread. And this could have massive implications. These young people are the sort that give trouble to teachers, and teachers give trouble to them. They're known for all sorts of misbehavior, and they're not too good at school, and a lot of them drop out. And fortunately, they don't all show all of these characteristics, certainly not at the same time. But I hope that some of you who have worked with young people will know what I'm talking about. These kids are often regarded as troublesome and as defiant and as doing this deliberately, that they're deliberately trying to upset adult society. I believe they are not. I like to say that in Ireland, we often give them LSD. And before some of you start calling the police, L for lines, S for suspension, and D for detention. Lines as in, I must behave in class, written out 100 times. I must behave in class. I must behave in class. Suspension, they are sent home. And detention, they're told to stay here in school. So those are the three ways that tend to be dealt with. The one thing they all had in common, and from my viewpoint, was a weakness in one critical cognitive ability, right? And that I defined as abstraction. Now, very early on, I realized I needed to spell out abstraction. And when I looked up the dictionary, I got all sorts of strange definitions. Abstraction is the ability to abstract. Now, whoever wrote that needs to take a course on how to write a dictionary. But I defined it as the cognitive ability to perceive outside of immediate experience. For me, that was abstraction, and that is the definition I base all my theorizing on. The cognitive ability to perceive outside of immediate experience. In other words, if I don't have abstraction, I can't see beyond my cognitive nose. It could be seen to be a product of cognitive complexity. As the child approaches adolescence, the brain grows and grows in its capacity to have all sorts of neural connections. And that gives rise to the possibility of cognitive complexity. The physical brain has developed, now the mental side can develop, and there can be cognitive complexity. But according to Piaget, of course, this was going nowhere without external stimulation. So this a stimulating experience is part of that development, leading on to abstraction. And by the way, I do want to say that the thinking of Piaget was very much in my head when I was going through all of this, and also the thinking of the Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky. Um, Piaget, because of his interest in the development of formal operations thinking or version of abstraction, and Lev Vygotsky because of his interest in the relationship between society and the development of language, thought and language. Both of those were very important. How do they differ from what I'm doing? They were looking at the development of abstraction. They were looking at the development of formal operations. I'm looking at what happens if it's missing. What happens if abstraction is missing? What happens if instead of the cognitive ability to perceive outside of immediate experience, the young person has the cognitive inability to perceive outside of immediate experience? I needed a name for this, and I came up with the word dystraxia. I found that an American comic writer had come up with the name as well, and I wrote to him, and he was very, very generously said, go ahead, he's not bothered by my using it in a totally different way. I wanted to define this early on because I wanted to make sure no one would come along and use it like a label that crucifies people, a label that puts people in a box that they never get out of. And so I say dystraxia is a psychological condition where an individual has not fully developed the cognitive ability to perceive beyond immediate experience to a level appropriate for his or her age. And that's my definition of dystraxia. Obviously, it's coming from the Greek, meaning there's something wrong with the ability to extract, to abstract. If it was just a theory isolated from everything else, it wouldn't be that important. But early on, I realized the effects of this were quite dramatic. And if I were working with a physical group in a room, I would be asking you all to sit aside in little groups and come up with ideas on all of these 6 headings. How might it affect the sense of self, the sense of principles, the attitude to others, the sense of responsibility, the person's grasp of time, a person's sense of sequence in general? If I cannot see beyond my nose, if I cannot think outside of my immediate experience, can I really grapple with any of these 6 factors? Let's have a look. And I start with the sense of self. You see, the self is the image of you standing outside yourself and looking back. So you need some sort of a psychological mirror outside of yourself. If you are unable to stand outside of your immediate experience, you don't have that psychological mirror, so you cannot reflect on yourself. So things like self-awareness, identity, self-esteem, self-evaluation, conscience, all of these will suffer. For example, the person who's dyspraxic will not be terribly aware of their own appearance to others. Even the other day coming down the street here, I heard a group of young people shouting, and they were really, I said, why are they shouting? And I thought they're shouting because they haven't stopped to become self-aware. We don't go around the street shouting as adults because we think, people will think we're crazy. Young people haven't reached that point yet and must be forgiven. They haven't reached that point yet. But you can see there are all sorts of possibilities there if I am not able to be aware of myself, right? All of these things can suffer. Then the dystraxia and principles. If I cannot link ideas together, beyond, because principles are abstractions, they're not in my head, they're something outside of my head, thinking and dealing with other people. Then belief systems, respect for others, loyalty, justice, fairness, rules, law, all of these become very difficult to grapple with. Now, I should say when I'm talking about dystraxia, I really do believe it is a continuum. It's, a person from totally dyspraxic until they're totally abstract. But people are in different positions along that line. A child of 2 or 3 will be dyspraxic by definition almost, whereas a person of 20 hopefully will have a fairly developed sense of abstraction. But when I'm talking about dystraxia in this presentation, I do need to talk about, the 0 the zero situation, more or less. Number three, and I think really important, this one, if I cannot stand outside of my immediate experience, how can I put myself in your shoes? How can I see the world from where you are? How can I be empathic? How can I understand other people? How can I understand individual differences? How can I interpret the feelings of others? And if you think of the impact that's going to have on relationships, it's massive. If I cannot really read the relationships, the feelings of other people, it's very difficult to be in relationship with them. And I list a whole rake of things there that, we could debate this for a long time, but I want to point out the key components from my point of view. Number four, dystraxia and responsibility. If I cannot see beyond my nose, then I cannot see the effects of my actions and the fact that they come from me and that I own them. So the ability to accept responsibility, ownership of my actions is diminished if I am dyspraxic. The ability to plan is affected as well. All sorts of things, logical thinking, awareness of the value of effort, because the value of effort depends on me seeing the effects of my action. All of these things will suffer if I'm not seeing beyond my nose. For those of you who are working in youth retreats or community training centres, I would hope that you're beginning to realise that a lot of the young people who fail at mainstream education end up in your classrooms, in your centres, because that they haven't had qualifications. And a lot of them are in this category. The other thing I want to say, having said that, is there's no better place for them to be. And I've said this umpteen times. Youth retreats and the community training centres are the jewel and the crown of Irish education. And my one complaint, I made this complaint to an inspector once, and he was delighted to hear I had a complaint about youth retreats. I said they don't share their ideas with mainstream education. Mainstream education needs to learn how important it is to relate to young people, how important it is to have projects that are not, 2 or 3 years ahead in time and planning. Youth retreats and community training centres will use short-term projects which develop what I think of as this mental muscle that leads to abstraction. And I think that this both explains the sort of clientele that these centres get, but also the reason for their success. One of the reasons, apart from having dedicated staff, of course. Number five, the sense of time. Time is an abstraction. It doesn't exist. In Ireland, it barely exists, as you know. But I cannot imagine a moment apart from now if I'm not able to see beyond my cognitive nose, So the sense of time passing and changing, awareness of the future, planning. The child who doesn't have a homework done, is it because they didn't want to do it? Or is it because that yesterday, today didn't exist in their head? It's a kind of cognitive blindness that I'm talking about. And we don't tend to punish or criticize people who are blind because they cannot see. If there is a cognitive blindness, then we need to stop criticizing and punishing. We need to look at it from a different way, a different viewpoint. Number six is really, I've really mentioned it already, in a sense, and responsibility. If I cannot see beyond my cognitive nose, then I cannot see how different events might be linked. So I find it hard to understand society, to understand what's happening around me. I find it hard to see sequence of events. Again, the ability to plan, responsibility, logical thinking, all these things suffer if I cannot abstract from the present moment. Adrian Furnham, a professor of psychology in London, said psychopaths tend to be impulsive and irresponsible with few clear life goals. They have a history of problems with authority and poor behavioural controls. They lack empathy and remorse and never accept responsibility for their actions. There's a few things there that sound familiar when you talk about dystraxia. Impulsive, few clear life goals. If you cannot see beyond your nose, you cannot really have goals. You cannot really have a plan for your life. Poor behavioural controls. With a lack of responsibility, you won't be able to control your behaviour as well as other people might. Never accepting responsibility for their actions, because the dyspraxic person doesn't see a relationship between their actions and the effects of those actions. Now, I don't for one moment want to say or even suggest that dyspraxic people are psychopathic. On the contrary, what I do want to say is that psychopaths are probably all dyspraxic. apart from other things. I suspect, and I'm guessing here, I suspect that a part of their problem is that they've had a lot of very negative experiences in early childhood. And put that on top of dystraxia, it's a dangerous combination. Okay, what are the implications then for dystraxia? If we've already mentioned some of the possible effects there, and what are the implications? Well, I think maybe putting on my psychological hat for a moment, I think it has um, repercussions for our understanding of intelligence. A lot of intelligence tests do test things like abstraction, but not without specifically saying so. And I also think it will affect our notion of choice. In the fairly well-known Horn-Cattell theory of intelligence, and they speak about fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. I should say there are many different approaches to intelligence. They're all trying to get at the same, some basic skill that is needed for an effective life, the intelligence. And they all look at it from different angles, and I think they're all valid angles, but they do look like different theories of almost a different substance. But in fact, I think they're just different viewpoints. I want to pick on the Horn-Cattell one because I think it's an interesting one. Fluid intelligence is the speed with which we think. And, we say somebody's intelligent because they can think faster than the average. Crystallized intelligence is the aspect of the content, the knowledge, and all the knowledge that a person brings to bear on living, and that is useful for an effective lifestyle. I would like to add to that another measure of intelligence, and I would call it structural intelligence. And I would like to compare these to the world of computing. Fluid intelligence is a bit like the speed of your computer, the central processing unit, how fast it can go. The crystallized intelligence is a bit like the RAM and the different versions of RAM that your modern computer has, the memory and the storage of information that it has. Structural intelligence then would correspond to the architecture of the computer. Computers, you don't need to understand this, but you'll have heard computers, 32-bit computer, 64-bit computer. It means they have a higher resolution. It's like when photographs moved from, the early computers from your green and black screen, and then to a screen that had 2 colors, and then a screen that had 256 colors, and then it went on to over 1,000 colors, and now we've lost count, millions of colors. Because of the better architecture, the modern day computer is able to cope with much higher resolution of graphics, much higher resolution of programming. And now, of course, we have artificial intelligence where the level of resolution and intricacy is just beyond understanding. So I would like to think that maybe we need a new measure of intelligence called structural intelligence, because a person who does an IQ test can be very fast, and they can have a lot of knowledge and a lot of knowledge of the world. But if they're not able to link things together at a more abstract level, then their way of coping with the world is limited. For example, self-evaluation, which is very important in reality therapy and choice theory, where the person is able to reflect on themselves and evaluate their ongoing behavior. The dyslexic person will not be fully aware of self, will have a simplified quality world, or the world of wants, will find it hard to compare the real and quality worlds. Well, in fact, anything that's beyond immediate experience, they will find difficult. Choice. The person who's dyslexic will see life generally as haphazard, almost fatalistic, a question of good luck rather than anything else. If they're stopped by the guards or the police for speeding, they had bad luck. It wasn't that they were speeding. If they had bad luck, and the policeman or policewoman is to blame for stopping them rather than themselves for speeding, they get a big problem with choice. And in social effects, these young people are likely to break the law and cause behavioural problems at school because they don't understand always what's going on, and their behaviour is likely to lead to all sorts of punishment. So there are social effects of this. In choice theory psychology, according to it, almost all our behaviour is chosen, but we cannot choose what we cannot see. And these young people cannot choose what they cannot see. And I come back to that idea of cognitive blindness or cognitive short-sightedness. If what I'm saying is true, then they cannot really see these things, they cannot understand them, and yet they're punished for the effects of that. They're punished for not being able to see things. Where might this come from? Where might dystraxia come from? In fact, I don't think it comes from anywhere. It's not. It's just that abstraction doesn't happen. So the dyspraxic form nature of the early childhood continues into adulthood. So let's go back to the diagram I had at the beginning. Brain development. The brain develops around adolescence, around the time of adolescence. It becomes capable of more complex connections and therefore of cognitive complexity. And if it receives adequate stimulation, then it becomes capable of all sorts of logical thought and of abstraction, right? So my thoughts about the origins of dystraxia is that if this stimulating experience doesn't happen properly, then dystraxia is likely to continue on into the teenage years and into adulthood. In other words, it's the lack of stimulating experience. And I like to define that as chaos, an experience of chaos in early childhood. It doesn't mean that childhood is chaotic. It simply means the child experiences their childhood as chaos. And that will lead to all these behaviors we've already mentioned. And why chaos? What impact does it have? Well, in a chaotic childhood, the child is likely to be ignored. It's likely to experience disorder, a lack of care, a lack of sequence in their lives, a lack of planning in their lives, anger and hostility, very diminished adult contact. No preschool education would happen as a result of that. An absence from school, which means absence from contact with other adults and interaction with their peers. No homework help, unpredictability of childhood, no planning, impulsivity. They would experience all of these things if they're experiencing a chaotic childhood. And I should say that that can come from all sorts of reasons. It can come from parents who are inconsistent, one parent saying one thing and the other parent saying another, and very often the parents living in different houses. It could, of course, come from selfishness, that the adults in the child's world are only interested in themselves. Or it could come from adults who have poor parenting and poor child rearing skills. Or indeed, they may have all the skill in the world, but they're overworked. They're trying to put bread on the table for their children, and they're overworked. Or they have poverty and they're short of money. Or illness. Illness can very much limit a parent's effectiveness, no matter how skilled they are. Or joblessness. And I do want to mention the word blame. We're not blaming anyone here. It's like you cannot blame your parents for your accent. And by the way, you cannot say the accent is genetic. You know, that, well, my parents had it, it must be genetic. No, you cannot blame your parents for your accent. It's just one of these things that happened. Your parents had a certain accent, you're likely to have a similar accent. The same with this. The parents who are giving the child a chaotic experience of childhood aren't necessarily to blame for it. It's just they may not know any better. It may happen accidentally. But I think that the lack of some sort of stimulating experience in early childhood is what holds back abstraction, and therefore dystraxia continues. Um, Other things I think can continue as well. If there's an experience of chaos in early childhood, then ADD, ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, ODD, all of these things are likely to happen from that similar background. Psychologists like to call this comorbidity. I much prefer to call it co-causality. Co-causality. And I would hope maybe after listening to my presentation tonight, you might think of those terms, particularly dyslexia, and look at it from a different light. If a child has an experience of chaos in childhood, what chance do they have? One author, whom I quote in my book, one author claimed that some children reach primary school with at least 1,000 hours of preschool tuition in reading. 1,000 hours. And they sit beside a child who has maybe 50 hours of reading before them. And then someone comes along and says the child with 50 hours is dyslexic. The problem is that that child then puts himself or herself in a box and says, I have a problem. I cannot learn, I cannot read, and I cannot learn to read. And the effects of that can be rather serious, unfortunately. Dystraxia, to sum it up in a diagram, I like to say it's the cognitive inability to perceive beyond immediate experience. It's probably caused, in my opinion, by the experience of chaos in childhood. And that can give rise to effects in 6 key areas here: the self, the development, the sense of principles, the awareness of others, the sense of responsibility, the sense of time, and the sense of sequence, right? And I think that chaos may also explain dyslexia and may also explain hyperactivity. Not necessarily in all cases. I don't want to say this is a general thing that's going to explain everything. The dyslexic child may be dyslexic because they've had brain damage or had a serious brain injury or brain illness, of course. And the same may go for dyslexia or hyperactivity. But I do believe that in a very big number of cases, the experience of chaos or the experience of a chaotic childhood can be the reason for these things happening. Um, okay, if dyslexia, then if it does exist, and if it is caused by a lack of stimulation and adult interaction in childhood, it means that we can do something about it. And this is a very important point. If my theory is true, then we can do something about it. Now, these young people are very unlikely to refer themselves for any help, and therefore the onus is on schools and educators in general to provide this. I like to say we dip into people's lives as educators or psychologists or counselors or youth workers. We look at development of the child. We look at courses and ideas to help them develop and grow, not only physically, but also psychologically. When things go wrong, we intervene. We create systems to intervene and help them. And we also try to prevent things happening. And in my own world, the development, we focus on choice theory psychology. In the intervention, we look at reality therapy or any form of counselling or intervention there. And prevention, we look at education and from the Glasser viewpoint, a quality school movement, where they are all ways that we try to intervene in young people's lives. They are not likely to seek counselling themselves because they're not aware of what's going on in their lives. In fact, in schools, they're likely to seek the counsellor in order to avoid going to class rather than to look for, to attend to a personal problem. I think that the theory has major implications in education for child rearing and for many social policies. I think that governments as well could pay attention to this because it might explain a lot of the things that happen in society. Due to the probable absence of self-referral, we need to use a proactive and preventative approach to dealing with dystraxia. I would like to see 4 different things. First of all, awareness of dystraxia, that people become aware, at least consider the possibility that this is a real psychological variable, become aware of it and develop research for it, develop guidelines for growth, inform and train teachers and parents, draw their attention to this possibility and promote a proactive approach. Also, I think it's very important that we stop the current damage, that we stop blaming kids for being kids. We stop punishing this short-sightedness of the mind or this blindness of the mind. We stop deriding the marginalised for being marginalised. We stop criticising them for things that are beyond their control and to no fault of their own. We start looking at ways to help them, and I will give you examples of this, by the way, to adopting a proactive strategy, recognizing it earlier. We need to ways to recognize this from early primary school, create interventions for remediation, and tackle the cause rather than the symptoms. And then to foster abstraction, and I think teachers in particular can foster abstraction in a multiplicity of ways in the classroom without losing any, in fact, of gaining impact in their particular subject matter. Investing more in education for child rearing and primary education. I worked in secondary education, but I firmly believe that primary education needs massive input of resources and money. Maybe I should say money and resources. I think it's very important that children are given a good start. Encourage greater interaction between adults and children. That the relationship is not just important in a warm sort of way, but it's important for in the Vygotskian way of the social learning of thought and language, that it's really important. And that's where grandparents play a very important role in many families. And adopting a grandfather or grandmother scheme would be very, very beneficial for a lot of people. We use approaches that train children to look beyond their immediate experience. This can happen now also, if you were Hamlet, how would you feel if you woke up in the middle of the night and saw this ghost walking around? You can actually encourage abstract thinking and hypothesizing and all sorts of things in education. That's where we can actually make a difference, I believe. What sort of interventions? And again, I'm suggesting these based on the theory. I don't have a lot of research, but I do know that some people are using similar approaches, not necessarily based on my theory, but similar approaches with young people with very successful outcomes. Adult interaction, the quality and quantity of adult interaction. If you're working with young people, uh, you may not seem to have a lot of time in the classroom or in the school corridors, but at the door as the kids are going into the classroom, you can pick out one or two kids and say, how are you doing? And get to know their lives a little bit. That can be gold dust to these kids. Give more responsibility, especially short-term responsibilities that they can see. They do undertake a project and they can see the outcome of that. In one centre I worked in, the young people prepared the lunch. When they came in at 9 o'clock, they had a discussion of what might be for lunch. Then what did they need to buy? They would go to the shops and buy that with the money provided by the centre. They'd come back and then work with Valerie, it was, in the kitchen and prepare the meal. And then the rest of the people in the centre came in, had the meal together. And by about 1 o'clock, they were saying to everyone, what a beautiful meal, well done, and so on. In other words, they saw a project through from start to finish, cause and effect, right? Give them more responsibility. Give them more choices. In an English class, the teacher could say, would you rather start with this poem or that poem? Or would you rather bring in a poem of your own? Give them choices. Choices, it's not a question of not doing the work, but it's a question of helping them choose and take responsibility for the work they're doing. Give fewer ready-made solutions. Invite them to think and to think out things. How could you measure the speed of a boat? I leave that idea with you. How can you measure the speed of a boat when it's moving through the water? I leave that idea with you. I'm not going to give you the answer. But, and I remember the teacher in my own school in Belfast when he said, you can't trisect an angle. We spent days trying to trisect an angle. Never managed it, but we spent days and learned a lot of mathematics in the process. Teach planning, deciding, looking at pros and cons. These are vital life skills. And these young people, by teaching these skills, you're actually helping strengthen this mental muscle, looking beyond the immediate experience. Use projects, especially short-term projects. And a lot of so-called extracurricular projects, like raising money for a local charity, they can be incredibly important. Bringing kids of different levels together, working together, sharing different skills, but looking at a project from start to finish, and usually short-term, usually a lot shorter term than, say, state examinations might be. Encourage hypothetical thinking. How would your life be different if tomorrow you woke up and found you had wings? I leave that thought with you as well. Hypothetical thinking. It's really good for helping someone look beyond their noses. Constantly invite alternative viewpoints. The art teacher can ask them to paint a vase full of flowers. Say, but don't paint it from where you are. Imagine you were sitting at the other side of the vase. Paint it from there. And as you're helping develop new points of view. Issue regular thinking challenges. What is 5/5 of 2/3? I leave that with you as well. Teach science. You will say we do teach science. We teach physics and biology and chemistry. That's not science. They are sciences. Science is the method we process information that looks beyond the immediate. How do we know the world is not flat? How do we know it's round? That's science. How do we know how to live our lives? How do you know what's good food and what's bad food? How do we know which detergent really washes clean, no matter what the advertisements might say? There are all sorts of opportunities for science. Use magic. A magic club in a school can work wonders because magic, you're basically deceiving people. You're using misdirection to help them think that you're creating magic. And teaching young people this, you're helping them look beyond the immediate experience. You're helping them put themselves in someone else's shoes and see your performance from the audience point of view. Invite frequent metaphors and similes. If you were to be compared with an animal, what animal would you be like? What is your animal? What flowers would represent your life? If someone wrote your life story and made a film of it, what music would you use? All of these things help people look beyond the immediate and are quite fun to do in a classroom compared with some of the things to do in a classroom. The use of photographs or video. A lot of these young people are coming from a chaotic experience of childhood will not have a photographic record of their early childhood. Schools are ideally placed to provide photographs of different events and even invite kids to bring in photographs. School trips and planning for the same. Involve them in the planning, help them plan the school trip. There are all sorts of ways that, in fact, it's not a question of adding to the work of teachers or people in youth centres or youth reach or wherever. It's a question of doing things in a slightly different way with a focus on abstraction, on developing a person's sense of responsibility and this mental muscle. There's one thing I want to mention. You've probably all seen kids, you give them a rattle or a new toy, and within seconds, the toy is on the floor. They throw it on the floor. You pick it up and put it back in the cot or the pram, and the kid throws the toy again. What's happening? I believe that that can be a very important moment for the child. It's not the toy, it's not the rattle of the toy or the little car that runs on the wheels or whatever. It's the fact that they can get an interaction with an adult. It's the fact that they can get an interaction with the world outside. Cause and effect may be the first time in their life that they're actually having some impact on their environment. Now, I'm not for one moment suggesting that if you never thrown a rattle on the floor, that there's something serious missing in your psychological development. I don't want people rushing home to buy a rattle and throw it on the floor. But what I am saying is there are little interactions like this are more significant than we might realize. And if a child is devoid of interactions like this, then abstraction may never develop, right? Another thing that a lot of adults engage in is the peekaboo game where they hide from the child and they say peekaboo and they appear. And the child is learning that out of sight is not out of mind. But it's also learning something about his mind, that the being is still there, that person is still there. And again, well, you might go home and practice peekaboo with your partner or your family. I'm not responsible for any consequences of that if you do that. It's not a necessary thing in life. Don't worry about it if you have never done it. But I'm saying, using it as an example of something, an interaction between adults and children that may help develop this abstraction. And if you can imagine a family where none of this happens, where there's no discussion of planning, no discussion of the child's self, no awareness of things beyond their noses, then they remain dyspraxic. They don't become dyspraxic. They remain dyspraxic. There are lots of authors who, I mentioned at the beginning, have dealt with similar populations. I think in particular of Ross Greene, Richard Lavoie, and Stuart Ablon. They have dealt with similar populations. They have different explanations of what's going on. And Stuart Ablon in particular has developed a whole series of exercises that are very effective in helping young people change. Where they differ from me is that I am saying that it's the lack of the ability to abstract is at the basis of all of this behaviour. That and possibly other things, but I think it's a major component that explains, and it also offers some sort of a template for helping young people come out of this dyspraxic world that they're in. There are other authors that speak about similar terms, distrationalia, mentalization, binary thinking, executive processing, transcendent thinking, all touching on the theme and all recognizing that this population exists. Simon Baron-Cohen, who's probably better known for his famous brother, is an expert on empathy. And again, all of these things, for me, point to a problem with abstraction as I define it. I do thank you for your attention. I think it's very important that I get these ideas across to an audience that can think about them and maybe share them with other people. But I do want to remind you, it is a theory. I'm guessing at things here to some extent. My hypothesis, insofar as a hypothesis, is that the cognitive inability to perceive beyond immediate experience does exist, that this is a real psychological variable. It can lead to serious personal and social problems, and it can probably be offset by quality adult interaction. Okay, I want to introduce an idea I've had for some time here, which I call the safe hypothesis. You can have several hypotheses about a phenomenon. If one is safer than the other, then it makes sense to go with the safer hypothesis. If my hypothesis is wrong, will acting on it do any harm? Will the exercises I mentioned, will looking for this in young people, will it do any harm? I think the answer is no. It won't do any harm. If my hypothesis is right, will not acting on it do any harm? I think it will. I think if we don't pay attention to the development of abstraction in our schools, if we don't look for these young people, if we don't try to steer them away from situations where they're punished for being the way they are, then harm will result. And these young people will end up possibly in lives of delinquency and poor qualifications, unemployment, all sorts of things arising from that situation. So therefore, I think, for me, the safer hypothesis is that dystraxia does exist and that we will work on it to help young people change. Um, I have a book on this, but I do believe it's really important that we stop to think and we stop blaming these young people. We stop shouting at them, punishing them, detaining them, suspending them, expelling them, and marginalizing them simply because they cannot see beyond their immediate experience. On my book, I have this drawing in the front, and the bottom part represents a black and white thinking of dystraxia. This simple, very simple view of the world that can't see beyond immediate experience. And I would hope that by understanding dystraxia, we could help them reach this much more colourful, more varied, more interconnected world of abstraction that is an important ability for dealing with their lives. Goramila Maihagov, Golair, thank you all very much for your attention. And I will follow this up with some discussion, but I really do appreciate your attention, your attendance here tonight. Thank you very much.